In 1980, a man walked into a hospital in France for a minor leg problem. Routine visit, nothing serious. The doctor ran some scans just to be thorough, and then the doctor saw something on the screen that made him stop completely. He called in colleagues. They looked at the scans, they looked at the patient. They looked at the scans again. Because what they were seeing was medically impossible. This man, this completely normal, functioning, married, employed human being, had almost no brain. The space inside his skull where his brain should have been was almost entirely filled with fluid. What brain tissue remained was compressed into a thin layer around the edges, less than a millimeter thick in some places. He had been walking around like this for 44 years, working, talking, thinking, loving, living, with almost no brain. And nobody, not him, not his family, not a single doctor in his entire life, had any idea. This is not a story about medicine. This is a story about the deepest question in all of science. What exactly is the mind? What is consciousness? And if a man can think, feel, and live a full human life with almost no brain, then what are we actually made of? Let me give you the full picture first, because the details of this case are even more extraordinary than the headline. The patient was a 44-year-old French civil servant. He lived in Marseille. He was married. He had 2 children. He held down a stable government job. By every external measure, he was a completely ordinary functioning member of society. His IQ was measured at 75, below average but not severely impaired. Enough to work, to communicate, to raise children, to navigate daily life without anyone around him suspecting anything unusual. When the doctors examined his brain scans more carefully, they discovered something that deepened the mystery even further. This was not a sudden injury. This was not damage from an accident or a stroke. This man had a condition called hydrocephalus, a condition where cerebrospinal fluid builds up inside the skull over time, slowly, gradually, over decades. The fluid had been accumulating since he was an infant, slowly expanding, slowly pushing his brain tissue outward toward the walls of his skull. Over 44 years, it had displaced almost everything. The ventricles of his brain, the fluid-filled cavities that normally take up a small portion of the skull, had expanded to fill roughly 90% of his cranial cavity. Neurologist Lionel Feuillet and his team published the case in the medical journal The Lancet in 2007. They described finding a massive enlargement of the lateral ventricles, third ventricle, and fourth ventricle with a very thin cortical mantle. And yet, the man was sitting in front of them, talking to them, asking them what the scans meant. Alive, aware, conscious. Now, to understand why this is so scientifically shattering, you need to understand what neuroscience has believed about the brain for the last century. The brain is the seat of everything. That has been the foundational assumption of modern neuroscience since its very beginning. Your personality lives in your prefrontal cortex. Your memories live in your hippocampus. Your emotions live in your amygdala. Your ability to speak lives in Broca's area. Every function, every thought, every feeling, mapped to a specific region of brain tissue. This is not fringe science. This is mainstream neuroscience taught in every medical school on Earth. Damage the hippocampus and you lose the ability to form new memories. Damage the amygdala and you lose the ability to process fear. Damage the prefrontal cortex and your personality changes completely. We have spent over a century mapping the brain, identifying which piece does what, building an incredibly detailed picture of the organ that makes us who we are. And the clear implication of all that mapping is this: you need your brain, all of it, to be conscious, to think, to feel, to be you. And then a man with almost no brain walked into a hospital in Marseille and sat down and told a doctor about his leg problem. And everything got very complicated. Here's where the story goes even deeper, because this man was not unique. In the decades since his case was published, scientists have documented other cases of people living full or near full lives with dramatically reduced brain tissue due to hydrocephalus. Neurologist John Lorber at the University of Sheffield in England had been documenting similar cases since the 1970s. He famously described a young man who came to him as a university student, mathematics student, first-class honors degree, IQ of 126, socially normal, completely functional. Lorber scanned his brain and found that he had virtually no brain at all. His skull was filled almost entirely with cerebrospinal fluid. What cortical tissue existed was a thin layer just a millimeter or two thick. Lorber asked a question in a 1980 paper that has never been fully answered. He asked, "Is your brain really necessary?" At the time, it was treated as a provocative but ultimately fringe question. Neuroscience marched forward with its mapping project. Bigger and better brain scanners, more precise identification of functions and regions. But the cases kept accumulating, slowly, quietly, in medical journals that most people never read. People with dramatically reduced brain volume living normal or near normal lives. Each one a small explosion in the foundations of what we think we know. Now let's talk about the theories. Because scientists did not just throw up their hands and walk away, they tried to explain this, and the explanations they came up with are in some ways even more fascinating than the mystery itself. The first and most widely accepted explanation is neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize itself, to reassign functions, to route around damage and find new pathways. The idea is this. In a normal brain, functions are handled by specific regions, because that is how the brain developed when it had room and resources. But when the brain is gradually compressed over decades, as happens in slow-developing hydrocephalus, it can adapt. It can redistribute functions across whatever tissue remains. It can become extraordinarily efficient, using less to do more. Think of it like a city that loses most of its roads over decades, slowly, gradually. The people adapt. They find new routes, they combine trips, they build new pathways through areas that used to be unused. Eventually, the city functions surprisingly well with a fraction of its original infrastructure. Not perfectly, but well enough. The key word is gradually. This is why cases of sudden catastrophic brain damage are so devastating, while cases of slow-developing hydrocephalus can sometimes result in surprisingly preserved function. The brain had time to adapt, time to reorganize, time to become something different from what it would have been. But here is the problem with this explanation. Neuroplasticity explains some of it. It does not explain all of it, because we're not talking about minor adaptations. We are talking about a brain compressed to a thin shell performing functions that require billions of neurons operating in complex, coordinated networks. There is simply not enough tissue to run those networks the way we understand them. Which brings us to the second and far more unsettling theory. What if our model of how consciousness works is wrong? This is the question that the French civil servant's case forced onto the table, and it has not left. The dominant model of consciousness in neuroscience is called the neural correlates model. The idea that consciousness is produced by the physical activity of neurons. Fire the right neurons in the right patterns and consciousness emerges. Damage those neurons and consciousness diminishes. Destroy enough of them and consciousness ends. It is an elegant model. It fits with most of what we observe, and it has one very attractive feature. It keeps consciousness firmly inside the skull, inside the brain, inside the physical body. No mystery, no magic, just neurons. But cases like the French civil servant punch a very uncomfortable hole in this model. Because if consciousness is simply the product of neural activity, and this man has almost no neurons left, then where is his consciousness coming from? Some researchers have begun exploring alternative models. One of the most discussed is the idea that consciousness may not be produced by the brain at all, that the brain may instead function more like a receiver or a filter, tuning into consciousness rather than generating it. This idea has been around in various forms for over a century. William James, the father of American psychology, suggested something like it in the 1890s. Several prominent neuroscientists have revisited it in recent decades precisely because of cases like this one. Under this model, a severely damaged or reduced brain would still be able to receive and filter consciousness, just with less precision, less resolution, less capability, like a damaged radio that still picks up the signal, but with more static. This is not mainstream neuroscience. Most neuroscientists still believe consciousness is produced by the brain, but the man with almost no brain has made that belief harder to hold with complete confidence. And that discomfort is important, because science advances fastest when something forces it to question what it thought it already knew. Let's talk about what this means for you personally, because this is not just an abstract scientific puzzle. Everything you believe about yourself, your identity, your memories, your personality, your sense of being you believe it lives in your brain. Your brain is the most protected organ in your body, encased in the hardest bone in the human skeleton, cushioned in fluid, wrapped in 3 protective membranes. Your body treats your brain as the most irreplaceable thing it carries. And neuroscience has spent a century confirming that instinct. The brain is everything. Damage it and you lose yourself. Lose enough of it and you cease to exist. But a man in Marseille had almost none of it. And he was there, present, aware, himself, raising his children, going to his job, talking about his leg. What does that mean about the relationship between the physical brain and the thing you call yourself? Is your identity really stored in the gray matter between your ears, or is it something else? Something the brain participates in but does not fully contain? I am not telling you the answer. Nobody knows the answer. That's the point. The man with almost no brain did not solve the mystery of consciousness. He deepened it. He took a question that science thought it was slowly closing in on and blew it wide open again. And the fact that we are still asking the same question that John Lorber asked in 1980, is your brain really necessary, says everything about how far we still have to go. Here is what I want you to sit with after this video. Right now. Tonight. There is a man in France, now in his late 60s, who has lived his entire life with almost no brain. He does not know he is famous in neuroscience circles. He does not know that his brain scans have been studied and debated by researchers around the world for nearly 2 decades. He does not know that his existence has quietly destabilized one of the most confident assumptions in modern science. He just knows that he went to the doctor about his leg in 1980, and the doctor looked at his scans very strangely. He is conscious, he is aware, he is a person with a history and a family and a life, with almost no brain. And nobody can fully explain why. If that does not make you question everything you think you know about your own mind, I do not know what will. Subscribe for more stories that break your brain in the best possible way. And drop your answer in the comments. If consciousness does not come entirely from the brain, then where does it come from? Think carefully, because nobody has answered that yet.